Okay, I say we can go ahead and kick it off if you guys are all okay with that. So hi everyone and welcome to our customer user group on Core Web Vitals. We have a great panel of speakers today and should have a pretty packed event with a lot to take away. So you have the ability to participate throughout this entire user group, and we really encourage it. We invite you to participate, be interactive, interact with our speakers today, ask questions, provide your own thoughts and comments and best practices. And if at any time you do have a comment or question, you can go over to the Q&A on the sidebar, and you have two options. You can either do a text Q&A or you can do video. Raise your hand and we will invite you on stage to chat. And then there's also the chat feature as well, which is a public chat. So if you want to go in there, chat with us, chat with other people, other customers that have joined, feel free to do that as well. And no need to wait for a Q&A. We'll be answering, accepting questions all the way throughout. So like I said, we do have a lot to talk about. So I'm really probably just going to jump in and let each speaker introduce themselves. My name is Kendall Matthews. I'm Customer Marketing Manager here at Catchpoint, and I'll be hosting, fielding through your questions, making sure that they're getting over to the speakers and just helping everything go smoothly. So I will go ahead and hand it off.
Thank you very much. Should we go back for the rest of the introductions? Okay. Oh, what is going on here? Boom. And I'll come back here. What happened to that slide? I'm just looking for, oh, there we go. We're back on the slide that we're looking for. So my name is Henri. I'll be one of your hosts for the day. I'm head of developer community. And I believe to my left is Tim Cadlick. I'll let him take care.
Yeah, I'm Tim Cadlick, Director of Engineering for Web Page Test. Bit of a performance nut, so.
Awesome. And Annie?
I'm Annie Sullivan. I'm an engineer on Chrome Web Platform at Google. I lead the team that does the Core Web Vitals metrics and web performance APIs.
Amazing. And I love that Annie is with us today. And for those who don't know, she may be one of the most important persons in what is the Core Web Vitals and how consequential they are. So we're really delighted to have you with us today. So thank you for taking some time. And we'll move on to the next slide. Amazing. So as Kendall mentioned, we are going to talk about Core Web Vitals today. So let's talk about Core Web Vitals. And what we're going to do is start to talk about what they are, the what, the when, and the why. So Annie, I'm going to ask you basically, what are Core Web Vitals?
So Core Web Vitals are metrics that try to measure web page user experience. We really have three main principles that we look at when we decide whether something is a Core Web Vital. First, does it measure the actual user experience? So like how fast the web page loads is a user experience versus like how many bytes of JavaScript that just maybe correlates to user experience. Second, we really tried to measure Core Web Vitals in the field. So we want not just the user experience, but what actual users of your website are seeing. Because that's going to be a distribution from faster to slower. Or a lab tool just gives you 1 point. It gives you great debugging data, but we want to go all the way to understanding like what everybody is actually seeing on your page. And then the last thing that we really focus on with Core Web Vitals is trying to make them key metrics, right? Things that are really critical to the web user experience.
Awesome. The web user experience is something that's going to come up a few more times, certainly throughout this webinar today. So, when it comes to the Core Web Vitals, Tim and I definitely remember at least, the metrics that have been sort of, bandied around over time. But when the Core Web Vitals came around, clearly a decision was made. And I was trying to understand, or could you also explain to the audience, why was that decision made to introduce Core Web Vitals?
Yeah, so the biggest thing that people are having trouble with that we really wanted to help with is just clarifying, like, there are so many metrics, time to first byte, TTI, down content loaded, onload, like all these metrics and names and things that you can measure. And we really wanted to give people some key points in the user experience that we could actually provide data for. We can see on your origin and Chrome user experience report, are you doing well on these things? And then you can start to dig into them and learn about all the other metrics. But we really wanted like a more simple entry point into web user experience.
Awesome. And when you mean simple entry point, so we were talking about not only developers being able to sort of like tap in, but also another community, potentially say like SEO practitioners.
Yeah, exactly. And that's another thing that we did with Core Web Vitals is their search ranking signals. So that's really exciting for users that they're going to get fast pages and pages with a great user experience when they search for things. But also, I think it helps websites be able to prioritize making sure that their user experience is high quality.
Amazing. Prioritizing high quality user experience. These are things that we're going to talk about today. So thank you very much for that. Now, one thing I do want to remind everyone, and Kendall mentioned at the start, if you do have any questions, please, by all means, this is pretty much an open forum. So please ask us by text, or you have the ability, believe it or not, to jump in to our webinar with us and do a video question. Is that correct, Kendall?
Yep, that's correct. They just go in and raise their hand under Q&A and we'll invite them on stage.
Perfect, perfect. All right, so you heard it right from Kendall. So let's move on to another section that we certainly do want to talk about. And this is a section that I gladly call the ABCs: amazing user experience, best practices, and we're also going to talk about conversion. So let's talk about these things. You know, as we've mentioned before, just in previous few minutes, we talked about how important high quality user experiences. So, you know, let's get into the details of how vital that is to have a good user experience. I mean, Tim, did you want to sort of chime in on that?
Sure. I mean, you know, kind of piggybacking off of what Annie was talking about with like how Core Web Vitals kind of came about, you know, one of the things that I dug about Core Web Vitals a lot, in addition to a little bit of stability, because I worked with a lot of organizations over the year on improving performance and which metric to measure. And then, you know, is always been a conversation, as well as, you know, when those metrics start to fade out of, you know, favor because something else comes along that's better. That stability has been a problem. So the stability of Core Web Vitals is helpful. But the other bit is like, these are all things that were rooted in what could have a real world impact. I remember, I think, Annie, you wrote that initial post, right? Like the whole foundation of this was like, yeah, making sure that if these metrics were improved, could they actually change something about, you know, user behavior in a positive way? And so that's, you know, that's been the heart of performance for the longest time. I love to tell people, like, I'm a geek. I will get really excited about improving performance by a couple seconds because that's just the way I roll. But we don't make things faster for the sake of making things faster. We make them faster because we think by doing so, we're going to provide a better user experience or improve the business in some way. And, you know, that's been demonstrated hundreds of times over the last decade or so, you know. Just how impactful that performance is, especially when, as Annie said, it's focused on metrics that matter to the user.
Absolutely. And, you know, I still remember the day I sort of discovered that, you know, web performance was really a user experience story. And, you know, because I considered UX kind of like a side, sort of side skill. And then, you know, it just dawned on me through a conversation, obviously, that, you know, web performance really fell under the user experience umbrella. So high quality user experience is certainly something that we're looking for as a user, but also as, you know, a provider of monitoring solutions so that you can see exactly what is going on for your users. You know, let's talk also about the B, the best practices that are involved when it comes to Core Web Vitals. Annie, did you want to sort of provide us some guidance there?
Oh, I think best practices is hard because there are so many of them. Maybe Tim is more used to like kind of like going down the tree of it, but from my perspective, I think it's always important to measure and monitor first, like to understand where you are and where you want to be. And then I always talk about doing less, right? Like less JavaScript on your page, less complicated HTML, smaller image bite sizes, everything that's on there, do you really need to do it? Because when I look at web pages, that's generally what I see happening is just a lot of stuff being done for unclear reasons.
Yeah, I'll
Absolutely.
second the measure and monitor thing. Like, I mean, I feel like that's where you got to start for any of this, right? Like, if you don't know where you are, then it's hard to be able to demonstrate any improvement that you're going to make. And if you don't know where you're aiming for, then it's really hard for you to, as a team or as an organization, to determine what is success. And you've got to have folks kind of rallied around both. And like having that monitoring, the robust monitoring in place from the start helps everybody. Because the other thing is, like, this is not, and Annie, I'm sure you've seen this. Like, this is not like improving performance isn't like a 2-week thing and then, hey, we're done, we're performant, and now we're done. Like, with that's not what happens. There's the stat that I can't remember the exact percentage, but I think it was Katie Hempenius who presented at a conference at Google, and they talked about all the work that they did with organizations to improve performance, and some significant percentage of those companies regress within 6 months because it's not just the immediate, like, let's fix this, but it's also all the cultural aspects. And one of the big parts about that, in my opinion, is making sure you've got the robust measurement and monitoring in place so that people can rally around those metrics, so that when you make a change, you can demonstrate the impact it has. Because otherwise, what's going to happen is eventually, if you can't ever connect that back in some way to that experience of the users, to the business, eventually it's going to lose steam. That stuff is what makes it last.
Absolutely. And, you've mentioned a lot of key sort of important details in there. I mean, like measuring, monitoring. I used to have this line, you cannot improve what you cannot measure. And ultimately, that will also include monitoring. I mean, you talked about the business aspect, and that's something that we're certainly going to cover in a few examples. But, let's talk about, let's start talking about the business and talking about conversion and how crucial it is when it comes to e-commerce. And Annie, in your experience, in your sort of like 50,000-foot view, and also in the same breath, the granular view that you have an opportunity to have over at Google, how important it is to e-commerce.
Yeah, so I mean, like the big view we have is like what is happening with websites as performance is changing, and we can do things like look at all websites and say, for the ones that meet core web vitals, we did an analysis about how often web pages are abandoned by users. If it meets those core web vitals, it's abandoned 25% less. And then we can also look at users, right? Users whose general experience meets the core web vitals bar. On mobile, they load twice as many web pages as users whose experience doesn't meet. So just like in like the broad scheme of things, we're seeing that like better web experiences are just so much more positive for users. And that's what we're really excited about.
Amazing. And sorry.
I was just going to jump in on that. There's a reach aspect too that comes with that, right? Like, we've seen, like Annie said, and I know, Henri, you've got a few examples coming up around conversions and case studies that have demonstrated that. But, the other bit of performance is, like, the more you improve performance, it tends to improve your reach, because now folks that maybe would have had a hard time loading that page or using that page in whatever conditions they're browsing on, they're able to. There was just a example of this, literally, I think it was this morning in the Web Performance Community Slack group, where somebody had posted a screenshot of Crux data for an origin, not for an individual page, where LCP actually, which, we haven't really defined those, but largest contentful paints. So when does the largest piece of content get on the page? When that was happening, according to the aggregate data, it seemed that largest contentful paint was happening faster than first contentful paint, which is when the first bit of content gets on the page, which by definition should not be possible. But when you aggregate the data, what happens, what this tends to signal is it means that, like, people are coming to that page and they're leaving before largest contentful paint fires. And so there's, the aggregation looks a little weird. But this is like, I don't know which site it was or whatever, but like, that's a prime example of, like, look, if they can improve their web vitals, if they can improve their performance, this suggests that there's quite a few people who are not sticking around right now that they could probably pull in after that. So it's also like conversion, yes, but also the reach and to start with, so that you have more people to convert in the end.
Absolutely. We're going to talk about session duration in a hot second, or at least provide some examples. And that's absolutely crucial, especially when it comes to e-commerce. Nothing worse than having someone leave your store before you even get to show them anything. So very crucial when it comes to e-commerce. So those were the ABCs. Let's kind of move on and look at some other items here. Okay, amazing.
Really quick, we actually have a couple, let's see, comments and questions if we can.
Amazing.
Over
I'm sorry.
there.
And thank you for saying that.
No, you're fine. So you can, if you want to pop in there as well, so you can read it, but I'll go ahead and read them out loud as well.
Let me see Q&A. Okay, there we go. I don't see
they're under
anything.
chat. These came in through the chat. So
Okay.
we have one.
Oh,
It
public.
says, let's see. Robbie says we are observing some trend. LCP on few pages are faster compared to FCP, and was trying to understand the root cause.
Which is essentially what Tim sort of alluded to, the LCP being faster.
Fact check me, Annie.
Yeah, so basically the thing that's happening in Chrome is like so you have this first contentful paint, and then we know there's an image loading, and the page is navigated away from. The image never shows. We do not record largest contentful paint in that scenario. So if you're looking at a distribution of first contentful paint and a distribution of largest contentful paint, you should be also looking at the counts of those distributions. There are like extremely minor definitional differences of contentful, but it's probably the thing that Tim said.
Awesome. Thank you very much for that question, Russell. And sorry I didn't see that. I was in the wrong chat. And let me see, sir, deck. Yes, I believe this deck will be shared. Is that correct, Kendall?
Yes. Yep. And then there's one other question further down. It's just the web performance Slack group.
The Slack group. Yeah. So the Slack group is public. Like anybody can join, I should say, from that perspective. We used to have like public access, but then we got hit with all sorts of spam. So if you drop anybody who wants to jump in, I don't know if they're able to do a private message or what that looks like, but if we have the email address, can send the invite from within the Slack group to get them in there. But I do recommend, like, it's really fun. It's like, it's not one of those Slack groups that's so busy that you can't possibly keep up. But, just in the last few days, there were conversations around, things like that exact thing, like why was LCP and FCP different? There were conversations around some CLS related stuff. There's just, they get in the weeds around some of the new perf things coming out, like the broadly shared dictionaries and all that stuff. So there's a lot of interesting conversations that happen.
Absolutely. Okay, we have apparently another question from Natalie. RCLS improved dramatically. What happened here? This just moved. Speaking of CLS, the whole page moved. Did that question just vanish? Apparently it did.
I'm so sorry. I tried to click on it to read it because it jumped, and then I think I accidentally clicked the delete button. I really wanted to know the question. I'm so sorry.
Okay. I think her name was
Annie. That's awesome.
No, I think her name was Natalie. If you could just
Natalie, we can I'll resend. Perfect.
Okay, awesome. Okay, so as you resend, we'll get into the rest of some of the details here, the rest of the deck, or presentation, pardon me. So we wanted to look at or talk about some successful case studies that we sort of keep track of, and we want to share some of those with you. So essentially, the following are great examples of organizations that optimized and monitored their core web vitals, providing much better experiences, increasing conversions and revenues, among other metrics. So let's take a look at them. And let's start with our good friends over at Shopify. So they're working with Sunday Citizen, which is sort of like a kind of like a furniture retailer, to improve their key performance metrics, and were able to achieve 25% improvement in largest contentful paint. Very important. We'll get into that in a hot second. 61% in cumulative layout shift at the 75th percentile. This resulted in a 4% decrease in bounce rate and a 6% increase in conversion, which is obviously great news, because if you have 6% more potential sales out of 6 people out of 100 who might sort of like help you increase conversion, that's always really good. And one of the key bits I wanted to mention, and I'll ask Tim to potentially expand on that, is a 25% increase in largest contentful paint is significant, especially in light of, I believe, the LCP being one of the harder metrics to sort of manage. Is that correct, Tim?
Yeah, LCP, and I'm sure Annie, you can speak to this, but LCP is definitely the metric that out of the 3 core web vitals tends to be the one that folks don't end up in that good category as often. It's definitely the lowest percentage of good. But for this particular study, if I remember right, I'm pretty sure I do. They had the LCP image was a CSS background image, and so it was one of those situations where to get to your CSS, a background image is going to be delayed because you have to download the HTML, you have to download the CSS, you have to parse all of that, and then you're like, oh, here's the image, let me go request it. So one of the big things they did here was just move that into the page itself. That way, as soon as the HTML is downloaded, the browser can parse, find the image right away. So it makes the request happen much, much earlier. So that's why I think they were able to get such a big jump here in the LCP for this particular one.
Amazing. Thank you for that. Now we have Natalie's question again. So thank you very much for your patience, Natalie. And it reads as follows. Our CLS score improved dramatically on one of our pages when we released a new version of it to production 20 days ago, but we still aren't seeing the needle move on page speed. Why would this be the case when that data is from a 28-day rolling average? Annie, did you want to take that?
Yeah, so I can start that answer. I think maybe people that are more, I assume Natalie's using like Catchpoint monitoring to understand like day by day what the CLS is. But from the page speed insights side, we do have a 28-day rolling average. And I also think that it's unclear to me whether it's like the aggregated at the origin level or the URL level. So you should check when you look at the page speed results. And then I'm not actually sure how often the 28-day average updates, if that's like a daily, or if it comes from the Croc monthly. I think it is a daily rolling average though. So I think maybe check in with like your RUM and see like did you see a sharp change in the real user monitoring on a certain day? That's the first thing I would look at.
Okay. Thank you very much for that. And Natalie, keep us posted if you have any other additional questions in the chat. Let's go on to our next slide. And we're going to talk about another successful case study, which is Groupe Renault. And I can say that because I do speak French. Found a strong correlation between largest contentful paint and both their bounce rate and conversion rate, with a 1-second improvement leading up to 14% point decrease in bounce rate and 13% increase in conversion. But the key here that we certainly want to highlight is the fact that Cédric Bazureau, who's the tech lead over at Renault, mentioned the following: performance requires constant monitoring as various technical teams can impact it. And, we were talking about this sometime back, but sometimes you have different teams going into the code base and some little changes are made and you're not too sure what may have happened, but constant monitoring will provide you some of that information if in case your LCP dropped out of nowhere. You'll get that little page saying, hey, this is LCP, we've just gone down the tubes. But the monitoring is very important in this sort of case study from Renault. I'm going to stop here and see what Natalie just added. Our RUM data shows a 90% decrease month over month. So
congrats. That's awesome. That's fantastic. Yeah, it's always a little tricky, to Annie's point, because like if you're comparing RUM that's showing you like in the moment, day to day versus something that's a 28 rolling day average, it's always going to be a little discrepancy. I would, just to echo Annie, like they could be aggregated to at the origin level instead of the page level, which could further complicate it, depending on, the amount of traffic that particular page gets. It sounds like that was an improvement on one of the pages. So, the percentage of traffic that page makes is also going to factor in depending on how that's aggregating. So, okay, so latest, so maybe it isn't a rolling, so that could be part of it too. I think, Annie, the other one, do you know how quickly so the Search Console, right? Like the Google console stuff, like how quickly that gets updated, because that might be another place to see. And I think that's a little bit quicker to get the difference. So you could check that too and see if the improvement in pages that pass the CLS standard have increased?
Yeah, I just asked on our internal chat. It does use the Crux API for page speed insights, so that the data should be a 28-day moving average, but from 2 days ago. So like it does take us a while to collate the data. So there's like extra few days in the 28 days. And then I think that the advantage of Search Console is that like it has more fine-grained URL data. And I believe it has 7-day averages as well. So it'll be good to check in there. I'm not super familiar with the Search Console since it is like a different org.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. And thank you very much for that, Annie. And again, folks, this is why we have Annie here. You know, definitely leads the team at Core Vitals that deals with Core Vitals at least. Let's look at our last sort of successful, case study. By continuously monitoring Core Web Vitals, Yahoo Japan News reduced cumulative layout shift, CLS, by 0.2, decreasing the number of URLs with poor performance in Search Console by 98%. As a result, they saw a 15.1% increase in page views per session, 13.3 longer session durations, and a 1.72 percentage point decrease in bounce rate. A lot of this data came from WPO Stats. If you're not familiar, it's an amazing sort of repo of business case stories when it comes to performance that you can go check out at WPOstats.com, curated by the fine Tim Cadlick, if I may add.
And Tammy Everts,
and Tammy Everts, absolutely. But again, here in this Yahoo Japan News example, we saw that continuous monitoring is something that was part of their solution. So we're going to come back to that in a hot minute. Let's see, we have another question, or is this a statement here from Ravi? We are tracking CWV using Next.js. However, Google Search Console shows difference of 400 to 600 milliseconds for LCP. This could be due to the fact Google decides eligibility criteria. How can we capture RUM data based on Google's eligibility criteria to match?
All right, I just sent a link in the chat with like our documentation on like how things can be different from RUM data to Chrome User Experience Report, or what you might see in the Search Console. The Search Console does aggregate by these things called page groups that basically you just have to look at the Search Console data. That's kind of is a separate org from where I work. But hopefully the documentation on the differences between what RUM can collect and what we see in Crux can help with some of those questions.
Awesome. Thank you very much for that.
One of the big things to keep in mind there is that Crux data, because of the, and I think this might be what you're referring to with the eligibility criteria, because this is a public data set, Chrome has to be very careful about the privacy aspects of this, which means that there are going to be subsets of the traffic where potentially that data isn't included or reported on because it gets to the point where you could potentially risk identifying users and stuff. So there are certain thresholds that have to be met. So there's a fair amount, and there's the capture period. There's a fair amount of differences between the way that those are measured that are always going to make those a little murky. I mean, I'm going to say something, I don't think it's very controversial, but it might be to some. But like, in my opinion, like if you've got RUM and you've got Crux, you obviously need to pay attention to both, right? Because we know that, the importance of the Crux data when it comes to the SEO perspective, cannot argue with that at all. But if you've got both, RUM is the one that I would tend to prioritize between the two. Certainly if there are differences you want to figure out, like try to focus on why. But RUM, if it's a good RUM provider, you're going to get a more comprehensive picture of like every user in a breakdown. And you're also able to connect it to your business metrics more easily. It's just, something to keep in mind. And again, that's not necessarily, it's not don't pay attention to Crux, but if you've got RUM, like, prioritize that, I would say, alongside of it, measuring those vitals, comparing where you can.
Yeah, I would strongly agree with what Tim said. It's just so much more actionable, right? To get the things that you are able to get from a RUM provider. You can get daily monitoring. You can connect pieces together. Like, okay, in this same page load, sometimes you can get information aggregated better. It's just a much better way to monitor it, and directionally, you're going to be moving in the right direction.
Awesome. Awesome. Thank you very much for that, Annie and Tim. Let's get into the next section. I believe we should be reaching, and that is the future, managing maturing metrics. Now, there we go. We looked at essentially, the past, how, core vitals came about. We're talking about the present, what's going on with the vitals right now, the LCP, the CLS, and FID, just in general. But we know that they're maturing, and a few years ago, I do remember when they were introduced, there was an immediate sort of conversation, sort of letting us know that, these, vitals, as they were called, were potentially going to mature. This was going to come up potentially through research or whatnot. So we know that they are maturing as we speak, and they're evolving. And, we'll get into what is actually happening, but, how important is that to know, just generally, Annie, if you want to sort of speak on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're trying to measure most of the same user experiences. How fast does a page load? How fast does it respond to user interaction? And various things that can be annoyances like content shifting around. So I think the important thing to know is, like, we're not trying to do a whole bunch of different things. We're trying to take the signals that we have and evolve them to be the best possible. So, for example, with first input delay, we have a really, what we think is a much better measure of user responsiveness on the web. So we're continually looking into ways that we can evolve what we have and get a better measure of user experience.
Absolutely. And, you'd mentioned first input delay and how that was sort of, potentially, I mean, some of the research you've been doing about around that, and maybe we can talk about, what potentially is the future, and at least we know it's on the horizon, and that's the IMP. Now, did you want to share a little bit of information about that?
Yeah, so one of the top frustrations we've had over the last few years with Core Web Vitals from web performance experts is the way that Core Web Vitals don't necessarily capture the full impact of very intensive JavaScript, long-running JavaScript. And over time, a lot of the patterns that, so first input delay used to catch a good subset of this. First input delay basically says, like, the first time the user interacts with the page, how much is that delayed by long-running JavaScript or other things that make the main thread busy? And when Core Vitals launched, only about 80% of websites on mobile had a good score there. And now over 95% of sites do. Sites are doing a much better job with the first part of, like, delaying the input there. They're using things like request idle callback to delay work. They're delaying third parties that don't need to be loaded right at load. But I think the web performance experts are telling us there's still a problem, and we're looking at the data and we definitely agree. So we decided to kind of extend that metric in two directions. The first is to look at all of the interactions on the page, not just the first. And the second one is, instead of just looking at how long the main thread busyness is delaying the interaction, also look at what runs when you interact and how long that takes. And we're seeing for many pages that the numbers in interaction and XPaint is catching a lot more problems. 1 in 100 page loads we see in Chrome, both on desktop and on mobile, freezes for 2 full seconds on a user interaction. We know from user experience research dating all the way back to 1968, we see consistently at the high end users with, like, some sort of visual response within 100 milliseconds. So 20 times that. 1 in 100 page loads. So we're really hoping that this new interaction and XPaint metric can capture these problems and help websites address them.
Wow. 1 in 100, 2 full seconds.
Yeah.
Like, I'm learning something.
Just
That's
freezing.
incredible. I did not know that. I mean, you're getting gems, folks. And again, for the folks who are definitely sort of deep in the e-commerce weeds, Beyonce fans will not wait 2 seconds to add to cart. Just be, rest assured that is not happening. Um, and again, we get back to the idea of how important or indispensable monitoring is, especially when it comes to the core vitals, and especially in light of potentially the INP coming about. Tim, did you want to sort of chime in on that and, sort of let us know why monitoring is going to be absolutely crucial when it comes to the vitals?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was alluded to on one of the other slides, right, where it was talking about the number of different teams that touch, the different components of a page. There's, like Annie said at the beginning, like doing less is a great performance strategy, and it is, and it's particularly because that's kind of the opposite of where we've gone with the web. But we do more, we do a lot more, and so on any given page, you have content that depending on your architecture, your setup, you've got media coming from one source, you've got analytics and trackers coming from another. You've got the JavaScript bundles. Increasingly, we're seeing a lot of folks using those kind of architectures. So there's a lot of heavy JavaScript bundles that, all it can take is a one-line require change inside of your code base, and you're suddenly shipping a lot more JavaScript down than you were before. There's just, in some cases, it's user-generated content. There's so many different sources of content and ways that things could get added to your page. Staying on top of it, like you've got to have that monitoring, and you've got to have it's not just the monitoring, it's you've got to have the alerting in place around it, right? So that if those baseline measures that Annie talked about at the beginning, if you've done your measurement, you've figured out what those targets are, you know what you're aiming for, and you've got to be watching for when those things blip, because if you see a regression in performance, you've got to catch it as soon as possible. I love this story. I think it was Zillow back in the day who blogged about, waking up one morning to find that they had gotten an alert that their performance had degraded. They clicked through to their monitoring platform and saw that there was a little code change that introduced a bug that added like 10 or 12 images or something like that to the page, overnight. And so they just sent it to the developer team and they cleaned it up right away. And it was like that whole problem got fixed right away. But that's exactly the kind of thing, because it was like the images got imported but not displayed on the page. So it was kind of one of those things where you didn't have monitoring in place. You would have been shipping megabytes of images down to folks for months without ever noticing. And we know that that has an impact on how people use those pages. So you've got to stay on top of it. You've got to have the alerting in place in case there's a problem, because you want to catch those problems. I mean, ideally, you're catching them before they go out, right? And that's where the synthetic monitoring comes in place, because you've got the RUM for after the fact. But some solid synthetic monitoring so you can test before you're ever going out live to production, because that's the best time to fix a performance problem, is before it happens.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. And I just had a presentation out of town, and I mentioned that monitoring in so many ways, and someone who works at Spotify who had just joined the company came to tell me, he was like, oh, I totally know this, and mentioned how this one time it was like, a late Friday, and they got pinged, about, some issue that came up, and it was that, it was the monitoring, it was the, getting notified and being able to tackle this issue immediately, instead of having this entire weekend of madness and come home, going to work on a Monday and saying like, what happened? Everything's on fire. But that is why we need the monitoring, folks. Sorry about that. Let's continue this amazing webinar, and we're going to talk about website experience. And for the entire time of this presentation, we've talked about metrics, and specifically modern metrics. This is not the web of old. The web is quite complicated today in 2023. So for the modern web, Catchpoint, we do provide modern solutions, and we're going to talk about a few of those right now. Now, obviously, we've been talking about core vitals. They're closely tied to user experience, but they're also closely tied to web performance. And at the end of the day, optimizing for web performance is going to provide good user experience. Kind of like, this big sort of, you know what I'm talking about. We didn't touch on it a lot, but there is SEO component to this, and this is something that we'll probably explore with in coming presentations potentially. The importance of core vitals, or performance optimizations, and how they connect with SEO. But one thing for sure, and we've mentioned this quite a few times today already, web performance monitoring is absolutely indispensable in all things modern web today. So from the tooling that we provide, great developer tooling, by the way, amazing cross-browser synthetic testing, and obviously, again, we've talked about the comprehensive but very accurate monitoring that is required and that we also provide. Because we can describe it in three very simple lines. On the left, what do we have? We have page views, we have session lengths, so duration. And you might start off with a little single test. Cool, things look good. It might have been synthetic testing, got it, no sweat. You might move eventually to the sort of like infrequent testing, kind of like, I feel like testing today, let me see what's going on. Cool, seems all right. Oh, you might pick up a little bug here and there, fix it, fine, and you may not pick this up for a little while. Then you might eventually move to weekly tests. But in that entire time, you're seeing your page views go up, that is, pardon me. You're seeing your session durations increase as well. Well, that is all due to the fact that, again, we talked about the multiple teams that might tap into the code base and make some little changes, but you're catching them before they catch you. But where you do want to be ultimately is in that continuous monitoring area, so that your session durations are nice and high. We see the page views go through the roof, because ultimately what you do want to get is making sure that you have, especially for the e-commerce folks out there, that your site is making money, your business is making money. We are creating avenues to revenues. So to talk about some of the sort of services that we have and solutions specifically, I'm going to bring in Tim to kind of go through some of the following slides to get into the details.
Sure, happy to. So, obviously, with the importance of Core Web Vitals, it's important to have that from every angle, and so there's quite a few different avenues for you to be able to measure and monitor that stuff in the Catchpoint product ecosystem today. So for one, if you're using the web experience monitoring platform that's inside of the portal experience, we've got that built on top of web page test now. So you can do the continual monitoring and get that detailed, look at every single request that you've come to expect. For those of you who have used web page test, that detailed per request kind of breakdown of exactly what's going on within a given page. Paired with things like, the film strip comparison and film strip view, so you can see the visual progress and how that kind of aligns with that waterfall. I mean, it's actually one of my favorite things about the web page test tool is just like the amount of diagnostic information that is jam-packed in that one single waterfall view is impressive. Like even here, you're seeing, your connection times, the request time, the wait time. You've got JavaScript execution, which is the little pink chunks. You've got the vertical lines telling you where the key milestones and page load occurred, whether or not a resource is render blocking, courtesy of the Chrome team for adding that tracing event for us. That was awesome. Breakdown of redirects and secure versus insecure. There's a ton of detail just packed into one single visualization there. And with that tool, again, the point of it is you're able to monitor this over time across different browsers and experiences. So here you're seeing you've got the visualization where you can see the dots, kind of how each test that was run on these different experiences, how they kind of paired up for some key metrics. You're able to zoom in on the timeline and kind of just hone in on those tests during that time period. And then you get all the information below on the key metrics. And again, for this particular product, it's worth noting that you'll see that link, that webpagetest.org waterfall. Every one of these tests is powered by web page tests. So if you click off from there, you're able to go think of web page tests as like your in the weeds diagnostic tool that will break down exactly what happened on that run. Those web page test runs have an entire page dedicated to debugging the core web vitals, providing new context around what exactly the LCP element is, when that LCP element was requested. We'll highlight it in the waterfall if it was an image. Exactly, visualizations of the shifts. You can see the different layout shifts occurring next to each other and see what the sources were for that. And a breakdown of which, components are responsible for all the heavy JavaScript execution. They also, each test actually includes, we query the crux data, and we grab we grab the data for that particular URL on that particular device type. So if you've done a desktop test, it's, spliced by desktop results only. If you've done a test on a mobile device, we query the crux data only from mobile data, so that you have a really strong comparison point between your crux data and what you're seeing in synthetic tools. It's a nice way for, I like it for sort of a gut check. How do I need to tweak my web page test settings to be a little bit more, throttled on the network or heavily throttled on the CPU to better align with what I'm seeing in the real world? But it's also just a really good, health check to see where you were standing at the time that you ran those tests. So there's a ton of detail packed into this tool, and a ton of ability to, again, focus on not just giving you the data, but then figuring out what the heck do I do about it? Because that's the important part. Nobody monitors things just for the sake of monitoring, right? We monitor because we want to be able to catch things and then fix them. So that's really important. In that same tool, we have the smartboard display where you can have those different alerts set up. So here you can see that we've got some, based on a threshold of 1 second, our first contentful paint alerts are firing pretty much in every test location and every test environment. You can also see below that where we're plotting for each run, like how you've been doing recently for those different metrics, and the core web vital specifically, but there's also breakdowns for Lighthouse, which we run on every test. Assets, you can have your own custom things that you're kind of demonstrating there. So again, it's all kind of meant to give you immediately, once you land on this page, exactly how you're doing, how have you been doing recently, are there any things you need to take action on today? And that's kind of the point there for that. One of the things that most of you, if you're using the Catchpoint portal for a while, are probably very familiar with at this point, but it's worth pointing out because it is a powerful thing, is the Explorer tool. Because this is your ability to really splice and dice it. You can get in there and customize everything about it. What time frame, the time interval you're looking at those, the different visualizations, everything from, simple line graphs to, CDF distributions and things like that. Splice and dice it by the browser version, which actually is quite handy, because one of the things we haven't talked about here, but, and I feel like it's stabilized a bit, but, as these metrics get rolled out, there's been a lot of work on the browser side to make sure that those metrics are accurately measuring what they're meant to measure. And so sometimes you will see differences in LCP from one version of Chrome to another or something like that. So being able to break this down by version can be really helpful as well. And again, the Data Explorer just lets you splice and dice it however you want, so that you can get those different visualizations. Here's one where it is, again, trying to break things down by what they're pulling out of the user agent string. So that splice and dice capability is massively valuable and important. It's actually one of my favorite things, if not my favorite thing about the Catchpoint portal, is that Explorer, because if you are a data geek like me, you can have lots of fun in there.
Absolutely. And thank you very much for that, Tim. And let's move on to the next slide, which is the ultimate slide, which is questions. Now, I know you've been asking them throughout the whole webinar presentation, so thank you very much for that. Let's sort of dive into a few that I've seen coming in here. What about this one right here? How do you recommend working with CWV, so the vitals, in Google Search Console? At what point do needs improvement or poor pages harm SEO? I hope I read that right. Annie, were you able to see that?
Yeah. So from just to understand a little bit better about how organizationally the Core Web Vitals are done, the Chrome team that I work on, we design the Core Web Vitals metrics, but it's a really kind of a hard wall between us and Google search ranking and how ranking works. So we don't actually know the details of how search ranking works, or what you can like how they're weighted in the ranking algorithm.
I will say, last I heard is not a penalty. Last I heard, it's a boost, meaning that and to get the boost, you had to be good in all 3 categories. And this was from somebody on the Google search team. But basically, the gist is if you're at that needs improvement or poor, and again, I think they're looking at are they looking at 75th percentile, right? For all of this, yeah. So if it's you're poor or your needs improvement in that 75th percentile of any of those core web vital metrics, you're not going to get the little bump that you would from the core web vital stuff, is what I had heard. But you're also not going to it's not like you're being actively penalized. It's just that anybody else who's kind of on even footing with you otherwise, if they perform well at that, across all 3 categories, they're going to get a little bump over you. So basically the gist is, if your 75th percentile on any of those is below that good threshold, you probably should put a little focus on it. And again, that's purely from the SEO perspective, let alone, the returns it's going to have on conversion, bounce rate, all that kind of stuff.
Thank you. And speaking of SEO, this is something that, internally we've been sort of talking about and making sure that we look after the SEO community. And, speaking of, are there any SEO practitioners who are tuned in to us today? Please let us know. I don't know, give us a little thumbs up emoji if you're out there, because we definitely want to know how, say, an SEO professional will use some of the tooling that we provide, because hello, Irina, I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly, at Disney listening. Well, thank you for listening. But we certainly do want to make sure that we are sort of providing solutions and tooling that is friendly to the SEO community as well, because we do realize that, developers are, very much fans of some of the tooling, especially, as Tim mentioned earlier, web page test and the dashboards that we provide on inside the Catchpoint portal. But we certainly do want to make sure that, again, the SEO community is heard, and that we hear you, we see you, and we'd love to hear more about what it is that you do with some of our tooling. So we have another question here from Ravi. What is the recommendation for handling / reporting CLS for spas? For those who are not familiar, single page apps, or MPAs, every page, every page hard reload and CLS gets reset and marked for new URL. However, for SPA, it is soft navigation and cumulative numbers are added. Annie, do you have any answers here?
Yeah, so the way that we report this in Crux and in Search Console is that it's for a multi-page application. In 2020, we did update the aggregation of CLS. So although it's still called cumulative layout shift, it's not literally adding every single layout shift for every single until you navigate away from the SPA entirely. It's just looking for the worst burst of layout shifts. So that's what we report. But I do think it's great. Another big advantage of run monitoring solutions is that you can break these down and understand which SPA URL might have the worst problem with CLS. We define the WebPerf API specifically this way so that people can break things down how they think is best for them to understand and debug. We also are working on, we have an origin trial right now that does SPA navigation measurement and can monitor these things for individual soft navigations. So we're actually soliciting feedback on that right now. I'll see if I can find the link to put it in the chat.
The soft navigation heuristic stuff is really, really exciting because it's, it has been a gap. Not even just with core web vitals, just performance in general. Measuring on spas have always been a little bit harder than the MPAs. And there's a lot of, theory out there. Well, there's a lot of debate in the developer community about the merits of SPA versus MPA performance perspective, but without having a nice definitive heuristic from the browser, it's really hard to compare that. So this is a big step. I'm also, to Annie's point, like RUM libraries can do this. Like I know the Catchpoint RUM library, for example, you do have the ability to manually signal like, hey, this was a different page load. So, you can track those as different views and break it out for an SPA. Just make sure that my advice there is for any solution that you might take where you're manually trying to measure that, and you should, if you're running an SPA architecture, just measure like 10 times. I worked with one company who, had been measuring the performance of their single page application for a couple of years based on one particular point in time. And then started working with them. We looked at the data and found out that actually that particular moment in time was happening twice and was only being reported the one time. And so in reality, their actual transitions between their SPA were a good 600 to 700 milliseconds slower at the median than what they had thought it was for 2+ years, because again, there's some manual work involved. So definitely make sure that you are, once you instrument, test the heck out of it.
Yeah, we really, as we're working on things like SPA transitions and interaction in Xpaint, we actually like you open up the dev tools and you can just see where the developer or the framework had marked these things in user timing. And we are seeing like a lot of the times those marks are off. So we're hoping that this origin trial and API can help with that.
Absolutely. And Ravi followed up here. I feel we pay penalty for SPAs compared to MPA, even if we can track soft navigation. Handling layout shift is difficult. Data is not available on page load, unlike SSR pages. CLS is not as easy as it once was, it seems. And I'm not even sure if it was ever easy, but it certainly has been a bit of a challenge. The one thing I actually want to ask, Andy, is the following, because again, I'm not claiming it's going to happen anytime soon, but it seems like everyone's waiting for FID to drop out and IMP to sort of come in and take its place. IMP certainly seems like, and we're talking about interaction to Xpaint for those listening, a metric that is technically experimental, but is kind of like a candidate to replace first input delay. Are we going to see sort of like this collective drop in percentage good core web vitals?
Yeah, it's really interesting. The more popular a site is, I think the more problems it does have with heavy JavaScript and interaction. So if we look at the most popular sites on the internet, I think that we're going to see a bigger drop than if you look at sites overall. I think, yeah, it really depends on the site, but like the biggest drop we're going to see is in the very most popular sites.
Interesting.
I can go back and talk a little bit about this question. One thing to be aware of with CLS is we do have an exclusion for inputs after 500, like any layout shift that's in response to a user input, which is generally what a single page app navigation is. You can at least get the skeleton up and fill it in. But we've also done some UX research as we were doing the aggregation for layout shifts and looking at single page apps. And we found that some SPA navigations were actually much more frustrating to users in terms of layout shift than MPAs. Layout shifts tend to go down in multiple page application page loads, but in soft navigation, sometimes like the layout shifts happen in kind of a star outward from the input, and that can be extremely jarring. So I do think that if you're developing a single page application, that you should be thinking pretty closely actually about the layout shifts and how they are looking and framing things up in a skeleton and things like that.
Amazing advice. Thank you very much. And Ravi, I hope that answered your question, your query at least. In that last sort of answer, we are at the closing of this event. Am I correct, Kendall?
We are. I mean, we just had one more question come in. So, I mean, if anyone does have anywhere, we can go ahead.
Absolutely. I just see
Error
right now.
pages are excluded from Crux and Search Console and all that.
Oh, okay. House and calculated for okay, 500 pages. All right. Well, that was a quick answer. Thank you. And did you want to sort of add anything, Kendall, before sort of like I close it off, or should I close it off and you after? I don't know.
Yeah, no worries. I can go ahead and close it off. Of course, thank you to Henri, Tim, and Annie for joining us today and presenting to our audience. And thanks to everyone who joined and participated. I think we got some great questions and comments throughout. Hope you're able to take away a lot from this for Core Web Vitals. And I will be sending out a recording as well as a survey to get your feedback today. If you do have any other follow-up questions, you can either put it in a survey or go ahead and just respond to the email that we send out. So I hope you all have a great rest of your day, and thank you for joining.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, Annie and Ravi. Thank you very much for your questions as well. We enjoyed this session.